Well, now, as we look ahead to 2024, the black vote may not be such a softball for Democrats, and particularly President Biden, as he seeks a second term. Now, historically, black voters do tend to vote blue, but recent polling shows that Trump may be making inroads with black voters in several key swing states. Joining us now for a closer look at this is Calvin Dark. He's the principal and co-founder of RC Communications, a public relations and branding firm in Washington. Calvin, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
Good to be here.
Awesome. Well, getting right to it. A new poll from the New York Times shows former President Trump pulling 22% of the black vote polled in 6 key battleground states. Now, we know in 2020, of all the people who voted, he came in with 12% of the vote. That's a significant number, 22. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the first thing we have to keep in mind is that a year out from the election, people are going to look at their lives, they're going to look at what they think could be done better, and that blame is very necessarily going to fall on the person in power. That's a very different question than next November in the voting booth having to make that decision between Donald Trump potentially and Joe Biden. I think one of the other things that is a challenge for Joe Biden and for Democrats is that a lot of the progress that he has made is not felt real in a real way for a lot of voters. For example, with student loan forgiveness, just because the plan was struck down by the Supreme Court, he made a lot of progress. We're having a conversation on that issue that we weren't having before. Same thing with the economy. The numbers are in Biden's favor, but people don't feel it yet. So those two things are going to be two dynamics that are going to be at play between now and next November.
So we're talking about what President Biden has done that people aren't feeling, but what could it be about the former president, President Trump's policies and agenda that would attract black voters? Or is it just more about what President Biden isn't doing or what they're not feeling?
Well, first, we have to admit that Biden is doing extremely well on one major campaign promise, and that is not being Donald Trump. And that characteristic is going to help him a lot if Donald Trump is the nominee for the Republicans. Let's be honest, a majority of African Americans are going to vote for Biden in the election. However, we know that this election will be close, as all of our recent elections have been. And we know that if just a small percentage of African Americans stay home, or if this increased percentage that's showing support for Donald Trump actually follows through and supports the former president, that could make the difference in key swing states like Michigan, where I am, Wisconsin, and others. So a lot's going to happen between now and next November, but if the polls are to be believed, it is a very serious challenge for Joe Biden.
So we're talking about President Biden. You said if they stay home, it could make the difference. So what does the president have to do to gain back those black voters to make sure that they do show up at the polls?
Well, even though the majority of African Americans are going to vote for Biden, he cannot take that vote for granted. He has until next November to make his case that the priorities and issues that are important for African Americans, that they are priorities and issues for him, and that he has to explain what he's done in this first term that makes him deserve a second term. And I mean, Biden's got to have the receipts. And so it'll be interesting to see on the campaign trail if he can really bring those receipts and make that convincing argument to all voters, and particularly African Americans.
So, Calvin, we talked about what he has to do to bring people to the polls, but we also know following the 2020 election, there were a lot of voting restrictions put in place, specifically targeting communities of color. So how will that play a factor in this election coming up?
It's something that we should all be focused on, because to really get democracy, you have to know what people want. And to get that, you have to have voting that's accessible. And one of the things that I want to remind people, and, as we look at some of these restrictions that happened during 2020, and some of those restrictions still remain, or they're being proposed, a lot of people have said, if you look at places like Georgia, where there were restrictions, but African Americans, either voted at the same numbers as before before, even increased, just because a group of voters, in this case African Americans, rise to the challenge of overcoming the obstacles to vote doesn't mean that those obstacles aren't there. So you're going to have a lot of voter advocacy groups, a lot of Democrats who are going to be keeping their eye out, because that small amount of restrictions, for example, in key states, could make the difference in the national election.
As you said, something certainly to keep an eye on. Calvin, thank you so much. Calvin Dark, principal and co-founder of RC Communications. Thanks for spending this afternoon with us.
Thank you.